Hello and welcome, everybody. We're going to give people just a few minutes to get settled in, and we'll be beginning in just a moment. Welcome, everybody. We're going to wait just about 30 more seconds or so to let people come in, get settled, and we'll be starting up in just a moment. Okay, we'll get started. So again, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for attending the webinar tonight. We're very excited to hear from our experts on this topic. You'll be hearing from a couple of them very shortly. But just to get us started before we plunge too far into this, we're going to take just a moment to recognize Dr. Matthew Gold, who is a member of the Organized Medical Staff Section's Governing Council and Policy Committee to provide just some brief introductory remarks. So Dr. Gold, please take it away.
Hello, we're very happy to have you here. We've been excited to get this together. This webinar is sponsored by the Organized Medical Staff Section and developed by staff and the Policy Committee, of which I'm chair. You know, the Organized Medical Staff Section was the first section separate in the AMA, and it now has more than a dozen. It started life as a house staff section, but it's evolved to be called the Organized Medical Staff Section. And it actually has evolved its representation for all practicing physicians in any type of practice, employed or independent, versus the healthcare systems as well as the hospital. So our calling actually overlaps the interests of all sections and indeed all doctors. Our hope and interest is to stimulate further discussion on this topic, more involvement of individuals in the section and beyond. And we would invite any to join us if you have the possibility to do so. This may also generate resolutions to guide the AMA in future actions on behalf of doctors and our patients. So we invite discussion here at the end of the presentations and contact with our staff about your ideas. And we may well be having further webinars in this vein, perhaps taking the unique perspectives of each of our component constituents, employed and in private practice, et cetera. So take it away, Jason. Could you introduce our moderator?
Sure, thank you, Dr. Gold. So just as Dr. Gold mentioned, there will be time for question and answers. We will be holding them to the end. There is a question and answer feature built into Zoom. If you have a question throughout the process that you'd like to sort of get into the queue, please feel free to enter it there, and we'll make sure it gets queued up for the end of the presentation. With that, we'd like to introduce Henry Allen, who will be serving as our moderator for the evening. Henry Allen is a lawyer within the Advocacy Resource Center of the AMA, where he primarily handles antitrust issues in healthcare and health insurance markets. Henry's also authored the AMA's issue brief on collective bargaining for physicians and physicians in training, which is available on the AMA's website. We're also going to be dropping a link to that document in the chat here. So if you haven't received it already, you'll be able to get a copy of it there. Prior to joining the AMA, Henry litigated healthcare antitrust cases in forums ranging from the Superior Court of Alaska to the United States Supreme Court in Jefferson Parish Hospital District Number 2 v. Hyde, which is the landmark exclusive dealing and tying case. Henry has also had experience in labor law and healthcare. For many years, Henry was the adjunct professor of law at Northwestern University School of Law. He's also been an adjunct professor at the Kellogg School of Management of Northwestern University and at Cornell University, where for 2 decades he taught health law in the Sloan Institute of Health Services Administration. Henry, it's all yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Jason. And thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm very, very pleased to be able to be a part of this program. You just heard that I have a background in antitrust. And as I look at hospital markets, I see them consolidate to the point where they have market power, not only in the sale of hospital services, but in the purchase of physician services, where often as monopsonists, they are negotiating with physicians under circumstances where the physician is not faced with a level playing field, is in a position to be coerced, both by market conditions, no options in the marketplace for employment, but also frequently with covenants not to compete, being part of the physician's contract. So physician unions, I think, have a role to play here. I'd like to start with telling you what the AMA policy is in the area of physician unions. And it's our AMA supports the right of physicians to engage in collective bargaining. It is also AMA policy to work for expansion of the number of physicians eligible for the right to collectively bargain under federal law. AMA did, however, suffer a setback in this area. In 1999, AMA provided financial support for the establishment of a national labor organization called Physicians for Responsible Negotiation. However, in mid-2004, after spending substantial sums on the venture that signed up few physicians, AMA discontinued financial support of the project. Are there reasons to think that an AMA-supported union might succeed today when it failed 20 years ago? 20 years ago, the vast majority of physicians were independent contractors. Unions are for employees, not for independent contractors. Today, roughly half of physicians are employees. Also, 20 years ago, when the AMA experimented with its union, employed doctors were mostly physicians in training or employed by HMOs. Many of these physicians lacked the resources to engage in unionization. So perhaps an AMA experiment with a union could succeed today, while it failed in the 1999-2004 timeframe. To help us understand the possibilities, we are fortunate to have with us today 2 experts from the field of labor relations and the professions, with a concentration on medicine. Our first speaker is Diomedes Tissasouris, who is the executive director of a union known as the American Association of University Professors, Biomedical and Health Sciences of New Jersey. This is a labor union of 1,500 faculty at Rutgers and Rowan universities that teach the next generation of doctors, nurses, scientists, and health professionals. Before holding this position, Dio was the executive director of the American Association of University Professors, University of Connecticut Health Center chapter. His work on behalf of both unions brought more multi-year appointments, higher minimum pay standards, better access to childcare, parental leave, and less gender-based inequity. Mr. Sistoris holds degrees in labor relations and public administration from Cornell University. He also has a law degree from Indiana University. Our second speaker, Rebecca Gibbon, is an associate professor of labor studies and employment relations in the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. She has published widely on employment relations in healthcare and education, comparative welfare states, and labor studies. Her authored and edited books include Strike for the Common Good and Challenge to Change, Reforming Healthcare on the Front Line in the United States and the United Kingdom. She is currently the president of Rutgers AAUP AFT, a union of full-time faculty, grad workers, postdocs, and counselors. So Dio, with that introduction, take it away.
Thank you, Henry. Really appreciate it. It's good to be with you all tonight. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to share with you this important topic that I've really dedicated my life to. On a personal note, you know, both my parents who are in healthcare. My mom was a nurse for 30 years, and my father was a physician in geriatrics, in academic medicine. And I, you know, my career also, I represented federal employees before doing anything with medical faculty. And then when I realized that there was, you know, a union for folks like my father, I really jumped at the chance, and that's how I ended up in that Connecticut position. And I think being able to provide voice for physicians and medical faculty is really something important, because I feel like it's very missing today. And I guess you can go to the next slide. But what we're going to be talking about tonight is sort of how collective bargaining can be a part of getting the voice back and getting power back for physicians. Becky, do you want to go?
Yep. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to you today. So I'll just mention briefly, I think that those of you here probably have different amounts of familiarity with unions. Some of you may have now or have had family members who were union members. Some of you who are maybe unionized, a little bit more likely if you're currently house staff, or you may have been in a union when you were house staff and you no longer are. Just to give the sort of overview, and I see I have a typo here, but what do unions do? Not what do you unions do, but what do unions do? We think we can kind of put what unions do into three categories: collective bargaining, political advocacy, and mutual aid and welfare. And collective bargaining is the thing that only unions do. So other kinds of associations, advocacy groups don't do collective bargaining, and we'll come back to that, and Dio will say a little bit more about that. Political advocacy is something that lots of kinds of associations do. So the Audubon Society would do political advocacy around, you know, birds and environmental issues, and the AMA would do political advocacy around healthcare and physician issues. And mutual aid and welfare is the additional function, which I actually find interesting, which could be anything from unions that actually provide sort of traditional insurance benefits to much more informal kinds of mutual aid and support. But we can think of those three things as the categories of things that unions do. But the one that I would say is sort of special or really defines a union as a union is collective bargaining.
Okay, so what is collective bargaining? So this is the definition you're going to find on the AFL-CIO website. The AFL-CIO, by the way, is sort of a umbrella organization of many unions in the country. Most of the major national unions are members of the AFL-CIO. So I just use it as a very kind of simple, straightforward one that I think anyone going to the website could understand. Collective bargaining is the process in which working people through their unions negotiate contracts with their employers to determine their terms of employment, pay, benefits, leave, job security, safety policies, and more. Collective bargaining is a way to solve workplace problems, also the best means for raising wages in America. Indeed, through collective bargaining, working people and unions have higher wages, better benefits, and safer workplaces. So a couple of things here. One, there's a whole bunch of different things that you could potentially bargain through collective bargaining, because people usually think of certain, staple things like pay or maybe health insurance benefit, but there's a lot of different things that you do on a daily basis that potentially you could bargain through a unionized contract. A couple of things that we come into, I guess you come up with physicians, as a lot of physicians have individualized employment contracts. And even we I represent faculty at Rutgers, right? So we have two medical schools at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School, Robert Wood, and then we have another one at Rowan University. So everyone has an appointment letter at these particular schools, right? Those appointment letters are subordinate to our union contract. We're sort of cognizant that a lot of physicians, in fact, members may have their own individualized bargaining power because they might be a huge asset to their employer. So we kind of tend to usually, negotiate minimums or ranges so that it doesn't necessarily always inhibit, individualized bargaining power. So there's ways of balancing the collective and the individual. You see this also with Major League Sports, Major League Baseball, where you might have a very valuable player on the team who can still, cut a very substantial, lucrative deal. But at the same time, the union is making sure that, the players get their portion of the revenues coming into Major League Baseball. So those are kind of the analogies and the framework I'd like to sort of articulate, because I know collective bargaining isn't necessarily a concept that physicians have come into play with that often, but it can be very powerful in achieving change in the workplace. Next slide. So why should physicians engage in collective bargaining? So it gives doctors, a stronger voice, and just that sometimes, with big health systems these days, you have, management that might be across the state or across the country, where there'll be several layers of management between people doing the work on the ground floor. So often a union can actually bridge that gap, can actually highlight problems that maybe management didn't even know existed before. And just that alone sometimes can be powerful because, it creates a check on how entities are managed, right? The second bullet point here shifts power back to the doctor, especially economic power. And I noticed there was a question that the chat, Q&A about how many physicians are employees today. And I believe about 10 years ago that it shifted in the United States, where a majority of doctors are now employees, as opposed to being, partners or independent contractors or sole practitioners or any of those other kinds of things. So employee means you're working basically for somebody else. Somebody else is the owner of that organization, or you have somebody, who's in charge, right? And so I like to say that, physicians have gone to essentially being the boss, right? We're owning their own practices to working for the boss, right? And that change in sort of the economic, market sort of change and the consolidation, as Henry said, of the health systems has meant, I think, that physicians have sort of kind of lost the traditional economic and sort of political power that they've been accustomed to having over the decades. And so we are sort of kind of arguing that collective bargaining might be one of the tools by which physicians can kind of reclaim some of that power back in their favor. And so that is largely what happens when you have a collective, is that you can express usually more power as, you know, a united front, as opposed to just one person that they can ignore or they can get rid of or what have you. It's a lot harder to do that when you have a lot of folks doing that, especially when you have, you know, professionals that people tend to listen to. You know, collective bargaining also focuses on the needs of the doctor as the employee. And again, that change, or that acknowledgement, the thinking of the physician as the employee, that's very important, because I don't think we've necessarily, you know, developed the policies or the support or even sort of the mutual aid that Becky was talking about earlier around that concept. So collective bargaining could sort of help in advancing the doctor as the employee. And then, of course, you know, two other things here, burnout or as we call it, moral injury, because I think a lot of burnout is basically like the victim shaving, to sometimes they call it that, because, you know, really people are really passionate about wanting to do their job well and to execute very, you know, really excellent kind of patient care. And then they get sort of stymied by the system. And that's why I think we have a lot of that burnout that we have today. And by reclaiming some of the voice and reclaiming some of the power, at least we think, you know, theoretically, that we can maybe, that could be an antidote to some of the burnout and the turnover in the profession that we see. And then the last thing is membership. I know that depending on where you are in the United States, the AMA, you know, has sort of lost members in certain, you know, localities. Could collective bargaining be something where, you know, is an opportunity to grow the membership where it's once was lost, right? So these are all questions, all places where, you know, collective bargaining can be very useful to bettering the work lives of physicians everywhere. Next slide.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I think a lot of the times if you ask people sort of for an image of a union member or who you've known, or maybe previous generations in your family who were union members, with the exception of teachers, where you get a lot of sort of heavy industrial workers. So people think of auto workers, steel workers, miners, and often from another era, not necessarily now. So just a few examples of other sort of highly educated white collar professionals that are unionized and benefit, I would say, from collective bargaining. Faculty, which obviously would include physician faculty, but all kinds of faculty like myself. I like the example of the Boeing engineers. I like them because they're self-identified as nerds, and their sort of unofficial slogan is "No nerds, no birds," because the planes are kept in the air by their great nerd expertise. Many federal employees, so, you know, lawyers, analysts, all kinds of technical government workers, legal aid lawyers, a lot of nonprofit employees. I mean, all kinds of nonprofits, and that's been actually, it's a sort of small but rapidly growing area. And then, you know, the entertainment unions, most of TV and film is organized and works under collective bargaining agreements. That includes directors and most other folks who work in film and that aspect of entertainment. So just to sort of show that there are many highly educated, highly credentialed folks that are organized and that are bargaining collectively.
Okay, next slide. So this is a little bit about our organization. We're the AAUP BHSNJ. Our union is about 50 years old. It used to be a basically a separate university called the University of Medicine and Dentistry in New Jersey. And then that, and the faculty, and that, organized about 1970, 1971, around that time, because they thought that the university was very too top down, and public sector collective bargaining was new in New Jersey at the time, and they took advantage of that. And that's kind of how we were founded. And then in 2012, UMD&J got merged into Rutgers, and we remained as the union for the faculty on the Rutgers Health side, both at both medical schools, as I said earlier, New Jersey Medical School and Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. We represent other faculty there that are not just physicians. So we do have some nursing faculty, some dental faculty, other PhD. And and then down at Rowan University, we also have the School of Osteopathic Medicine. Next slide. So some of the things that we've accomplished through collective bargaining, to give you sort of a flavor of what you can do if you had a union contract. We negotiated minimum pay standards. This is actually in our latest Rutgers contract. The American Association of Medical Colleges does an annual survey of medical faculty salary, and that's by rank, assistant professor, associate, and by specialty. And so we use those standards. The lowest standard, I believe, is 25th percentile on there, as minimum pay standards in our collective bargaining agreement to keep our pay competitive. So that's just an example of something that's possible to create a sort of universal minimum, if you will. We also use other data, MGMA, for example, for clinical incentive plans and different kinds of bonuses. And then there's other things on here we're bargaining actually right now, where we've opened negotiations with the university. Some of these issues like childcare and parental leave are going to be front and center. In both where I was at University of Connecticut and the union here in New Jersey, negotiated longer appointment periods for faculty appointment letters. And then another kind of big issue that's come up more and more is sort of inequity in pay, especially based on gender. You see this all throughout the country. And then in the wake of the Me Too movement, you saw an organization called Time's Up Healthcare, which was a lot of medical faculty around the country that was focusing a lot on the pay gender gap, so much so that the AMC has actually published now, in addition to their normal benchmarks, the benchmarks that you see between men and women, which is very interesting. So that kind of issue, we're actually tackling it through collective bargaining, where we do have a procedure in our collective bargaining agreement where people can bring equity pay adjustments. And actually, Becky here, the language is borrowed from her contract, and the legacy non-health science faculty led the way in that, and we were able to benefit sort of on the coattails of that in our contract. So there's still a lot of work to be done because these gaps still exist, and the university is very slow, unfortunately, to put the systems in place in order to truly close them. But we're a lot better off, I can tell you, at Rutgers having this than not having it. If we didn't have it and we had to resort to just a faculty council or a university senate for these changes, we probably wouldn't even have any process for faculty right now. So anyway, that gives you just a flavor of what we've bargained and accomplished through collective bargaining. Next slide.
Yeah, I will say that we're presenting some sort of descriptive numbers about how many physicians are in unions, but it's a little bit hard to measure. The AMA has done some of its own estimations. There's census data available from the current population survey, but that's just a representative sample, which gets dicier as you get into occupational groups. But the number of physicians in unions has certainly been growing, and if you look at sort of, the number 7.2% in the US from 2019, this data takes a while to work its way through. That is pretty similar to the entire unionization rate in the population, although the rate is much higher in the public sector than in the private sector for all workers unionization. And that's, I believe, also true for physicians. There are a good amount of physicians organized, relatively speaking, still, very much a minority of all physicians, but in the federal sector and in the public sector, safety net hospitals, public health, correctional health, places like that. So it's small, but I would suggest significantly increasing.
Okay, next slide. So this is a list of some of the major national unions that have a significant amount of physicians right now under different local collective bargaining agreements around the country. I guess the largest one probably is SEIU. You can see here, one of their sort of local affiliates is a Committee of Interns and Residents, which has actually done a significant amount of organizing the last 6 months. A number of hospitals around the country have been organizing. We're going to go over a few of those examples in a second. In order to form a union, you don't necessarily need to link up with a national sort of brand or organization or whatever you would like to call it. I mean, it does help because they have the expertise, the knowledge, usually resources. And so that's why most times you see a successful drive, you do see one of these names sort of attached to it. But there are examples also you can see through what Amazon and Starbucks and a lot of other things happening now where workers are not necessarily going through a national union to do that. Next slide.
So, you wanted to,
Yeah, you can do this, Becky.
Okay, so what we're seeing lately, and we'll present a few examples, is physicians who are very clear, and you guys can speak to this better than we can about, especially those of you that have been working for some time, about the changing circumstances of your work, so that there's a really clear shift to those doing this work from the ability to actually exercise your own professional medical judgment to feeling completely that your judgment is unwelcome and is subordinated to the judgment of whether it's an insurance company, a healthcare organization, et cetera, but certainly patient care not being determined by those who know most about patient care, but by other factors. Often I would say, the pursuit of profit, but this complex set of institutional factors that really takes away from medical professional judgment. And that's really, I would say that combined with the fact that legally more doctors have become employees, which makes it much more straightforward to unionize, that's really spurred this fairly recent significant uptick. So if we go to the next slide, we just have a few very recent examples. Some of you might have heard about Stanford Healthcare, the House staff organized with the Committee of Interns and Residents. That's the major national union representing House staff. It's kind of concentrated in a few regions, New York and California, but also represents House staff Florida, New Mexico, Illinois, a decent size group there. And I don't know if folks heard about this, but there was a huge issue where sort of wealthy VIPs were put ahead of the House staff in line for vaccines when COVID vaccines became available. So the House staff that were truly on the front line treating patients with COVID every day didn't yet have access to this limited supply of vaccines, but wealthy VIPs who were really not at particularly high risk were. And that is, I think, pretty much the precipitating event And an 81% vote is obviously decisive. Many of these organizing drives are met by pretty vicious anti-union campaigns. And so often, even if the campaign starts off with a lot of the physicians saying they want to organize, it'll end up be quite a close vote. So this was pretty much a landslide by these House staff, who are obviously in what I would think is perhaps one of the most prestigious residencies in the entire country. But you, as we sometimes say in labor studies, you can't eat prestige, you can't live on status alone. You need sort of some respect and voice on the job, and they realized they didn't have it, so they organized. And on the next slide, there's an example that's going on now. This is sort of an interesting case. These workers, they're affiliated with AFT, which, even though that's the American Federation of Teachers, in name actually has a massive healthcare section and represents many nurses and a growing number of physicians. What's kind of interesting about these physicians who have organized for sort of all the reasons that describe things that many of you are facing, staff shortages, overwork, inability to provide the standard of patient care that they feel is crucial. These physicians actually organized with a group of professionals in their medical group that isn't just physicians. It's fairly unusual. So they're physicians, PAs, nurse practitioners, you see the list, RNs, etc. And so they took a different approach, and they've kind of organized as all of the professionals within that employer, rather than just limiting it to physicians. So I'll go to the next slide and go back to Dia.
Yes. So what is the applicable law that enables collective bargaining? And this is kind of rather important point, because depending on who your employer is, kind of determines what sort of legal collective bargaining rights either apply or don't apply to you. So for us, for example, again, we're a union of faculty at Rutgers and Rowan universities. Rutgers and Rowan are public institutions, right? So they're state employees. Anyone who works at Rutgers or Rowan is a state employee. So therefore, New Jersey Employee-Employer Relations Act is what governs. So it's the second bullet point here, the state statute. So and so for that reason, there's no question that our members have collective bargaining rights. They've had them for essentially 50 years. And also, we'll get to in a second, while we don't represent supervisors or people in supervisory positions, under New Jersey law, you can have a supervisors union that's permitted. And then, there's other two bullet points, 3 and 4, you're not going to see as much with physicians. So federal employees, there are some physicians in the VA health system that may, have a particular collective bargaining unit applied to them. I doubt if there's anything in the railroad or airline workers. The first bullet point here, the private sector employees, that's what we're going to talk about a little bit, just because it probably is the broadest, sweeps in the broadest amount of potential employees. So next slide. So the National Labor Relations Act, this is sort of the federal law that was passed, I believe it was 1935. Before that, there was no real collective bargaining law at all, right? There was some ability, there were actually things to stop unions where federal judges were, back in the early part of the century, granting injunctions to stop unions. So in 1935 was about the Great Depression and kind of reclaiming, certain policies for workers. So we got overtime and fair wage laws at the same time. And we got the National Labor Relations Act, which was supposed to allow basically a right enshrined in law to collective bargaining. And it creates a whole process essentially for both concerted activity when workers come together to do something in terms of petitioning or acting upon their employer, and also the formation of the union and bargaining with that particular organization called the union. So the second bullet point is what I sort of mentioned there, no formal union required for certain NLRA protections. So when I say concerted activity, if, 5, employed physicians that are covered by the act go to their employer with a petition and say, we want to change this kind of thing, that's a concerted action, right? And that's protected even though no union's been formed or certified or anything like that, right? So again, it's sort of the idea is it's trying to protect collective action. And probably one of the reasons for that in the law is that you need to be able to do some of that stuff usually when you're forming a union. So we can't put those protections on people once they formed it because you're kind of, limiting it in a way that was not be helpful. The other part of this is physicians who are supervisors are not protected by the National Labor Relations Act. So the National Labor Relations Act has a specific definition of who is an employee. And when employee, we think of somebody who's employed, but they're not exercising any supervisory duty. And so for that reason, sometimes physicians can be classified as managers or supervisors. And when that happens, they're either taken out of the entity which is trying to certify to be a union, or they may all not be eligible for collective bargaining. So it's something to be mindful of if you are in a particular organization, whether that you would fall into that category. There are probably threshold questions way before you get to the legal part. If you want to form a union, is there enough support for it? Are there issues? All those other things I think are far more important. And then, if you do have, some legal issues, I'm sure there's an attorney or somebody who could help you, sort through those. But you should you should look at sort of those other more important issues as to what's necessary for a successful organizing drive first, and then, go to the more technical things as to who qualifies to be, a part of the bargaining agent. And then I think this is a good place also for me to comment, since this is the medical staff section. I'm sure a question would come up, can medical staffs also be unions, right? You already have an organization, that would be logical, right? So the answer to that is, I think it's possible if the medical staff wears a different hat, right? In other words, they change their name for the purpose of organizing or bargaining or something like that, but you can still use the same, email list or something of that nature, I'm sure, for the organizing. The reason why you have to change the hats is because I think in most jurisdictions, medical staffs are recognized as their own kind of legal personality, if you will. So they have certain functions, for example, peer review and credentialing and all those different kinds of functions that a medical staff does, certain quality standards, of course. And then, of course, when you're taking privileges away from somebody, for example, you have certain immunities that attach to that if you are doing it through the peer review procedure. So all those different functions that are traditional medical staff functions, I would say would probably have to stay separate. And of course, supervisors could be members of medical staffs, right? Where they can't, under at least an NLRA, be a member of the union. So for that reason, you could probably use the medical staff as your vehicle, but you just probably have to create some separations, change hats, that kind of thing, in order to be sort of successful in that effort. And of course, the individuals in the medical staff would also have to be employees of probably the hospital, right? So because a lot of medical staffs also have, for example, community doctors that may have their own practice, but they have privileges at the hospital, so they're not employees of the hospital per se, right? So again, it could be a vehicle, but there has to be sort of these issues that have to be worked through. Next slide. How are unions formed and contracts negotiated? So this is just basically a very quick explanation of that. So usually when a group of employees, if you take just, for example, a Starbucks, which is a very thing you could kind of visualize, but you might have 10 employees in that store. So the way they would go about it is they would collect cards from all the employees that are, again, not supervisors that qualify to be employees in the unit, and they petition the National Labor Relations Board with these cards saying we want to form a union where we have an exclusive representative that bargains with just that representative over our terms and conditions of employment. So they get us, usually you don't want to, even though you could probably petition, I think it's with 30 or 40% of cards legally, nobody ever does that because as Becky had said earlier, there's always this anti-union drive. So you want overwhelming support. If you have a store of 10 people, you want 9 people or something like that, wanting the union because when, the anti-union campaign gets started later on, that support might erode, right? So so that first step is you get your cards, you petition the National Labor Relations Board, and then the National Labor Relations Board will conduct an election. And that election, people vote up or down as to whether they want an exclusive representative to represent them on those conditions of work, terms and conditions of employment. If the vote is successful, then, and there's also, of course, a lot of opportunities for legal challenges, a lot of technicality here, but for the sake of simplicity, if that vote is successful, your union is then certified, and then you can begin bargaining with Starbucks, right, as to what you want to change, whether that be pay, benefits, non-compete clause, whatever it is. So that's sort of the rough process. This process could take a long time, depending on how much delay there is in elections or and the anti-union portion, where before the election, that's when the employer usually tries to convince people that unions aren't a good idea. And so there's a lot that has to go through to get from sort of the first bullet point here to the last bullet point. But that sort of fills in, I think, a little bit of the process of how you get from sort of A to B in this whole sort of scheme, if you will. Next slide.
So I think this is a question that has been coming up in the Q&A, and I think it's critical, right? Does being in a union or having collective bargaining mean you have to strike? And the answer is no, absolutely not. Strikes don't happen very often. Even you might have seen some of the press around sort of Striketober last year, and there were some high profile strikes, Nabisco, John Deere, places like that. And journalists would call me and ask me to comment on Striketober, and it was like, well, it's kind of a blip or an uptick. It's not, on the grand scale of things, a large number of strikes. And so strikes are really rare among employees in general and doctors in particular. And I think the important thing about collective bargaining and unionizing is thinking about collective voice and collective power. And there are so many ways to do it. And some of you likely work side by side with unionized nurses and may be familiar with some of the ways that nurses work to build community support from the other people working in the hospital or in their workplace, and patient support, and striking is really just one of them. So you'll see the ways in which as a contract campaign may be getting a little bit more intensive, other actions are possible. CIR with the house staff, they are very big on what they call solidarity break, which is 15 minutes walking outside. And for all the house staff, I don't know if any of you guys have experienced that from the attending side or from when you were house staff, but that's significant, right? If all the house staff vanish for 15 minutes, that's gonna have an impact. Patients and other staff are gonna notice, but they're not gonna do it if it's gonna put anybody at risk, right? So coordinated action can sort of show our work is important. You need us here doing this, but it's not likely to be a strike, and it's not necessary. If the members decided that they wanted to strike, for example, because they're having a lot of trouble achieving a contract, they would take a strike vote, and unions don't even get close to striking unless, I guess like a super majority, over 90%, want to strike. And even then, that's often the sort of game of brinksmanship to get you over the finish line in bargaining a contract. And patient safety is always obviously paramount. So strikes are not likely, and anything that you would do collectively would be democratically decided. Unions all legally have to have bylaws, and they're majority rule. So whether we're talking about what goes into your contract, who the president of your union is, or what kind of action you want to take, there's democratic procedures in place that really determine that. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see what challenges physicians would face. For sure, there are challenges. We've talked a little bit about anti-union campaigns. Labor law is not great, especially in the private sector. It varies widely in the public sector. So if you work for state or local government, you'd be covered by the law in your state. If you work for federal government, it's federal law, but it's a different law from the private sector law. It can take some time. It's also a lot of work just to organize with your fellow doctors, to talk to them. People really lack familiarity with unions, so you often have to start from a fairly fundamental starting point, dispel some myths around unions, and also understand how this is affected by individual contract provisions. And as Dio mentioned, it's it's the same as, you know, professional athletes or movie stars in most cases, where we're going to be talking about a baseline or minimum. And so different physicians would then be able to negotiate something above that, but the baseline is secured. And some of those procedures, whether we're talking about, you know, the right to due process or equity provisions, professional development funds, things like that, would potentially be consistent. So education and empowerment are really the first step. And I would also say just talking to your coworkers, you know, breaking some of those taboos about having conversations where you say, you know, do you feel you're able to exercise your professional judgment in the workplace? Do you feel like the physicians are calling the shots, or the bean counters are following the shots? And just having those conversations with the people you work with can be really, really critical. We'll go to the next slide.
So is collective bargaining appropriate for all physicians? Not always. As I explained before, you might be a supervisor or high-level manager. You might be, just a few doctors in a practice and still have your own practice, and you want to sell that practice to a health system, and then you're going to retire in a year or two or something, right? So there's all different situations where it just, for whatever reason, collective bargaining might not be sort of the answer for that particular workplace, right? So this is just to say that it's not supposed to be a one size fits all for anything, but it's something where definitely we think that physicians should engage a lot more in this space and with this powerful tool to again reclaim a lot of the economic, political, and other power in terms of the practice of medicine and the strengthening the profession. And last slide. Next slide. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So just a few final points here. How can the AMA engage with collective bargaining and support the physician employee? So one idea here is also just at a very basic level, before you even do collective bargaining, just thinking of the physician as the employee. What can local AMA chapters do? What can you do as a national level? And some ideas are, know your rights type trainings, and trying to, let's say you have a seminar on how to read your employment contract, or, how to be safe at work, or just basic things that every physician who's an employee should know, right? How to avoid, sexual harassment or things. You get all that training, but sometimes when those things actually happen, people, they panic, they don't know what to do, right? And they're in very delicate positions. So having those tools and supports available to doctors as employees, I think is a good first step. And then what else can the AMA do? Could they adopt, let's say, a model that some nursing associations have, right? So if you look at the Ohio Nurses Association, the Ohio Nurses Association is a dual affiliate. They're an affiliate of the American Nursing Association, and they're an affiliate of the American Federation of Teachers. So they perform both objectives, right? They do their traditional nursing association trade things, the continuing medical education and all the the programs for nurses, just like you probably have some similar things at the AMA. But then they have a wing that does the collective bargaining, right, and negotiates contracts and organizes new hospital units and that kind of thing. New York Nurses Association was like that for many years. In 2012, they just started doing the collective bargaining part, and then now the affiliate of the American Nursing Association is a separate entity, but they were just like Ohio for several decades, actually. So can a state chapter of the AMA who wants to do collective bargaining, wants to put let's say a pilot program together, something, do that. That might be an interesting thing to explore. Not all organizing drives need to be large. You might want to start with just a small group. One of our slides that had the hospitalists from Oregon, I think that was 20 or 25 hospitalists in that example. That was written up in the New York Times. So it doesn't have to be massive, hundreds or thousands of people you're organizing. It could be just something small that you're doing for a very committed group of doctors. And then one other thought here is that could you start doing this more, let's say, with medical schools? Both the AMA and the American Association of Medical Colleges have a unique role in accrediting schools and fostering good employment environments. And a lot of that is usually focused on making sure supports are in place for medical students. But you can extend a lot of that, those kinds of things to residents and physicians, and making sure there are certain protections in place, or where doctors want to freely form a union, that's respected. So could you play a role through medical education and having this sort of become more normal in a particular medical school, right? So these are all just potential avenues of where the AMA could engage in collective bargaining. Some, of course, might be harder than others, right? But it's there to give you sort of food for thought on, what's the next step if people are excited, as I am at least, of getting every doctor who can get a union to have one, right? So with that, I think we will close and open to questions.
Theo and Becky, that was just enormously helpful. Guys are a wealth of information and advice and experience.
Thank you.
So we have several questions, and we've got some time if our panelists are willing to stay and get a few of these answered. I'll start with a sort of, one that we sort of just recently touched on, but one question is, are there types of physicians or kinds of physicians that would not have collective bargaining options under the law that you can identify?
Yeah, well, definitely, a CEO or chief medical officer, or somebody who's clearly a manager, somebody who's an independent contractor who doesn't actually have an employment relationship. There's sort of multiple different ideas, obviously, if you are self-employed. So it's really based on that idea of employment. But yeah, that's would be the answer to that.
Yeah, I'll add a couple pieces on this that crossed my mind. I don't know if this affects anyone who's on this call, but I know that a lot of hospitals and healthcare systems have been changing and exploring new staffing arrangements. So in particular, things like outsourced employment to a staffing agency like Envision is one of the big ones. Many of them are owned by private equity, which is, the deeper you dig in that, the more worrying it gets, I would say. But if you're an employee, whether your paycheck is signed by the hospital where you physically work or by Envision, you're still an employee and you could still unionize. And I think just to go off of that, I saw a question maybe in the Q&A about, it wasn't put in terms of bargaining units, but who would you organize with? Is it just your hospital? Is it your whole system? Is it the whole country if it's a national company? And Dio could probably speak at length on this, but the National Labor Relations Act has ways of defining what an appropriate bargaining unit is. And just because you work, for example, for a national healthcare company, you wouldn't have to organize nationally. So that's what we see like at Starbucks right now, where they're organizing store by store.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, it depends on sort of where the control is exercised. And sometimes you might have, I mean, Starbucks is not, I don't believe, a sort of a franchise system the same way, you know, other entities are. So sometimes you can have sort of 3 stores under a common owner, depending on those kinds of fast food businesses. And that's how you define the unit. Sometimes you define it more narrowly, but yeah, you don't have to, you know, the Starbucks workers don't have to get every, you know, majority of all employees in the country in order to form a union. That would be nearly impossible. So there's ways of defining the unit. And usually it's just for the purposes of knowing, you know, who once the unit is certified, who it bargains with, right? But it's not it shouldn't be a hindrance to, you know, a local effort usually to form a union. It just might mean if there are several locations, you might have to do several elections opposed to one, you know, election. So.
Great. So we have a couple of questions, and I'm gonna merge a couple of these questions together, but we have a couple of points from people wanting to know about either alternatives or possible pathways for independent positions in collective action or collective bargaining. And if you are familiar with any examples of that, or if you can think of any implications for how to present this issue for that type of position.
I mean, I'll say that in general, we see, I can't think of examples of independent physicians, so attendings or something like that, although there's overlap in the case of academic medicine, and people have talked about, you know, under or over 50% of your employment. So if, there may be ways to look at that. But if we look at people that are, you know, really independent, working together, I'm hesitant to say too much in the presence of an antitrust expert, but I would just say that you know, collective action is certainly possible, maybe not around, you know, negotiating fees, but in terms of advocating for patient care, advocating against decision making that might be detrimental to patients, whether we're talking about, you know, lack of access to care in rural hospitals. And to my mind, you know, organizing with your coworkers is generally beneficial, and it doesn't need to be organizing a union. So it might be getting together and talking about, you know, what one example would be, a lot of healthcare systems are pretty callous when it comes to suing people over their unpaid medical bills, right? So could you get together and advocate and essentially speak in one voice? So ways of organizing together that may speak more narrowly to your employment relationship or lack thereof, or more broadly to your fight for sort of access to healthcare and making sure patients have the care they need. So I think, you know, there's a lot of different ways to organize, and organizing to the point of collective bargaining is just one.
Okay. So here's a question kind of related to payment models. Given that, you know, healthcare and medicine is incredibly complicated, and contract terms with insurers and the government can have a significant impact on how people are paid, are there examples of a physician union that could operationalize in that type of market?
So what type of market? Say that part again.
I think the question asking here is about how to sort of reconcile the different types of payment models and contract terms that physicians have now with the various insurers, and what the impact of that would be on forming some sort of collective bargaining.
Yeah, so I mean, if it's bargaining with the sort of the insurer, that's a sort of a different type of collective bargaining, and that's more what Henry was explaining, what was trying to happen in the late, I think, 90s with, you know, the different plans and that kind of thing. But yeah, there might be, depending on where antitrust law is now, there might be opportunities or not with that. You know, this is more sort of suited for more of a employment sort of context, as opposed to figuring out how physicians could use collective power to get better rates, for example, in insurance contracts and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the Justice Department, the Antitrust Division has seen understands physician collective bargaining where as cartel-like behavior, price fixing behavior. So for physicians to jointly negotiate fees with health insurers, the physicians would have to be in some kind of joint venture where they share risks and profits and are essentially a new firm competing in the marketplace. So the short answer is you don't want to appear to be jointly negotiating fees without being a firm-like organization.
So pivoting slightly on this, as I'm sure you guys are familiar with, most organized medical staffs will have organizing documents such as medical staff bylaws or terms and conditions of employment that are already in place within the medical staff. A question here is about the common areas of overlap between those different types of agreements. Given that, can you address any of the issues that things like the rules and the regulations and the process of, I'm just going to read this quote because it's I'm sort of mucking it about. Common areas of overlap that both medical staff bylaws and terms and conditions of employment could address. Can you list these? Sorry, I'm tripping over my words, everybody, tonight. You know what? I'm going to come back to this one after I can conceptualize.
Yeah, I get the sense of the question. I think the idea is, can we sort of better terms and conditions of employment through changes to our medical staff bylaws? And I say, yeah, I mean, I guess you could try that. I mean, there's certain things. I don't know that any medical staff I've seen, for example, usually address most terms and conditions of employment through their medical staff bylaws. I guess you could attempt to do that. But usually the medical staff bylaws that you mostly see are almost always aimed at sort of patient care quality and those kinds of issues, and admitting sort of who has privileges in the hospital. I mean, medical staff was, I think, originally created as an early way of sort of policing the profession. When you have a lot, today you have tons of stuff, right? You have all these accreditations, you have licensing and all that. When this was, medical staff was first created, I think it was over 100 years ago, right? And these are the first attempts at every hospital to kind of police who can actually practice in this hospital and that kind of thing. So that's where the origin comes from, and that's where the purpose really has always been kind of in mind. It hasn't been really an employment kind of thought behind medical staff, but so I mean, there are things, certain due process right there. If you need to, let's say, remove somebody's privileges, there's certain due process that's in every single medical staff bylaws, but that's not the same necessarily as firing somebody. You could keep your privileges and fire somebody, or you could fire somebody and keep their privileges, right? So the employment relationship may be different from the privileging relationship. It really has it's always had a different kind of objective in mind, but it doesn't mean that you couldn't creatively, if you got enough members of medical staff to want to address a particular issue, to pass it in a medical staff bylaws. Now, the thing is also a lot of medical staff bylaws, those amendments sometimes also have to be approved by the hospital board of directors. So even if you approve something that was, all the medical staff wanted, I don't know if the amendment would be final until the hospital board also voted on it. But it's an interesting sort of experiment if someone were to kind of try it.
So moving to another one, and apologies to the author, I'm going to tweak it just slightly, but do both of you have thoughts, if you're consulting with physicians who are considering some sort of collective bargaining, some sort of structure, and know that they want to look at one of the existing options that are out there, one of the existing unions. Are there thoughts that you would have to advise them about how they would evaluate which of those unions would be conducive to be a part of?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think you guys are all extremely well networked, right? You're probably quite tightly bonded with folks you went to medical school with and you did your residencies with, and you've all fanned out and gone to different employers. So I think, you know, you want to figure out, as Dio mentioned, there's a small handful of national unions that have experience representing physicians. And I think in general, it's a good idea to go with a union that's experienced, but they'll be eager to represent you, and you should talk to them and ask them the hard questions. Ask them if you can talk to the other folks that they represent. Often I think geographic strength matters. You'll have some regional union staff on your side if you look at who else might represent physicians in the area. So, but I think, you know, unions would be eager. Unions that are representing physicians are certainly eager to organize and represent more physicians. And you can ask them, you know, what's your approach? Ask them the hard questions. You know, I think that, you know, maybe you're in an area with a very, very low union membership rate and people aren't familiar. Maybe you're something where you're reacting to something so egregious that you think people are ready to go. And if you can just put some resources into things in the short term. So I think really talking to people, talking to other physicians, you know, and then asking those questions directly to the main unions, that especially if there are any representing physicians locally, and saying, you know, what would it look like, and seeing what they answer, and seeing if you feel that they really understand what you and your coworkers are looking for and what's motivating you to get organized.
Great. I think we have just time for a couple more if you guys are still willing.
Sure.
Okay. So one of these is mentioning that, you know, in some time previously, there have been federal court cases that determined that physicians were management rather than employees. The question is that still sort of an active finding or an active holding? Have there been pending cases that are relevant to challenge that consideration? What thoughts do you guys have, or what information do you have on that?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any case that sort of across the board bans it, right? So, you know, all the cases are going to be on a sort of case-by-case basis on the facts that are presented. What does the particular employee do, right? Whether they're a physician or any other, a nurse, whatever they are, right? And so the question is, does that particular, you know, in this case, physician occupy a supervisory duty? And there was a Supreme Court case called Kentucky River for some number of years ago, which was dealt with nurses. And it basically said that if you do any one of 12 duties with independent judgment, you can be a supervisor. So you could do 11 out of the 12 and not do them at all, and you just do one and you still are now a supervisor. So it's very easy for any employee to qualify as a supervisor. So that's probably why whatever case got litigated out there that you might know of, why it probably was not successful. There are definitely physician unions all across the country in the private sector. One of the ones we highlighted here, the first one in Oregon, hospitalists, I mean, they were successful, right? So usually definitely physicians that are more engaged in kind of shift work, you know, hospitalists, maybe ER doctors, they're probably better candidates because, you know, I don't see how they're going to be in that supervisory category. But yeah, again, it's a case by case, you know, approach, and you can't, even if there was an unsuccessful one in a particular NLRB case or it got appealed to a federal court or whatever, they really have to look at, you know, the facts as they are for that particular person. So
we address in our issue brief that, Jason, have you sent around the issue brief to the participants?
Yep, you can all find the link to that in the chat if you scroll up to the top.
Okay, so we discuss the physician supervisor issue in the issue brief, and I suggest that the questioner take a look at that.
So here's a very important question that everybody wants to know about. Generally speaking, what is the trend in unionization regarding salaries? Are they more or less than non-unionized positions?
So I'll actually address that question on another question I saw about sort of clinical outcomes. And we don't have good data on physicians. The kinds of physicians that are currently unionized don't really represent the typical doctor, right? It's mostly either residents or public sector, safety net, or federal sector doctors. That's not the typical doctor. So there's not good research or data on that. But we know, I would suggest maybe nurses are similar, but just across the unionized workforce. There is what we call a pay premium, or a significant increase overall for all workers, about 20% more if you're unionized than if you're not unionized. And similarly with clinical outcomes, I have seen, and I've looked, no good data on the different clinical outcomes for unionized patients of unionized physicians versus non-unionized. But there's some really great rigorous work on nurses showing that unionized nurses, the unionization of nurses leads to better clinical outcomes along a number of measures. It's, as I say, really solid data. It's not cherry picking on a number of really good, clearly measurable criteria. So the data is lacking. I think there will be more data as more physicians unionize, and so you can get properly representative analysis going. But for both pay and clinical outcomes, I would say more to come, but given everything that we know, it's sort of positive on both counts.
So one final question for you, then we'll wrap up. Do you guys have any recommendations about literature regarding patient safety outcomes, physician retention, financial benefits, basically all the things that we're talking about as they pertain to collective bargaining that you can recommend to the listeners?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to look. I'm actually going to put in the chat, and if I can, yeah, I can put it so everyone can see. This is from National Nurses United, which is a big umbrella nurses union. They have a compilation of studies which are primarily about nurses and nurse unions, but not entirely. And some of these are published in the top nursing, economics, other journals, and you can dig into that. I think in most of those links on that page actually go to PDF, so you can read the whole article, look at what data they're using, look at what measures they're using. But I think that's a good starting point.
Great, and that's been dropped in the chat for everybody. And I think with that, we're at time. So Henry, I'll turn back over to you to close us out.
Okay, well, thank you very much for attending our session, and I look forward to more dialogue on this very important issue. Thank you, Jason.
Great, thank you, everybody. Thank you for attending. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.